Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. Hope everybody is doing well. We're going to talk about, once again, the Bishop of Charlotte, Bishop Martin. He's been coming up a lot lately, right? We saw him putting some restrictions on the Latin Mass, carrying out Traditionis Custodes and the reforms of Pope Francis. We also saw him come out with a explanation as to why he did this. We covered that yesterday in that show, and he kind of gives his reasons, and he also addresses a lot of the pushback that he's received. But today we're going to address something else that has just come out from him, and that is some pretty big adjustments to the Novus Ordo celebrations of the Mass within his diocese. So a lot of this is, going on at the same time. So he reformed or restricted the Latin Mass due to Traditionis Custodes and is making some significant adjustments to how the Novus Ordo is going to be celebrated in his diocese. And we're going to take a look at that. I also want to briefly examine Pope Benedict and Pope Francis on the question of whether or not the Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo are two different rites or whether or not they're the same Roman rite. And I'll explain why that's an important question to briefly examine again. And then I want to briefly take a look at some comments from the very controversial Cardinal Casper. He's coming up once again in the news. This time, he is pushing for the women diaconate. He wants to see women ordained to the diaconate. So we're going to take a look and see what he said recently in a book and what people are saying about that as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to share my screen as we examine these different topics. And maybe let's start out light. Let's talk about the Roman Rite and whether or not, again, the Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo are two different rites or whether or not they are two different forms to the same Roman Rite. And I'll explain why that's important. Let's maybe start there before we take a look at what Bishop Martin is doing in the Diocese of Charlotte. Before we do that, though, let me remind you, hit that subscribe button and like button if you haven't already. I really, really would appreciate that support if you haven't already become a subscriber. Let me go ahead and share my screen and show you something from Summorum Pontificum. Now, I know we've covered this before in the past. For those of y'all who are regular viewers, this won't be anything new, but, we got a lot of people who are new to the channel, and this is kind of the first time they've seen this stuff. So sometimes we got to just reiterate some of the same material that the veterans of the channel have probably seen quite a few times, right? So this is from Summorum Pontificum. Well, actually, the letter accompanying Summorum Pontificum. Pope Benedict sent out a letter to all the bishops of the world whenever he released Summorum Pontificum. He also sent an additional letter kind of explaining why he did this. Pope Francis did the same with Traditionis Custodes. He also sent an accompanying letter to all the bishops. Okay, well, whenever he released Summorum Pontificum, that allowed for greater access to the extraordinary form, or what's called the Latin Mass. He says this is Pope Benedict XVI, as Pope, this isn't when he was Ratzinger, this is as Pope. He says it's not appropriate to speak of these two versions, that's the extraordinary form and ordinary form, the Novus Ordo and Latin Mass. It's not appropriate to speak of these two versions of the Roman Missal as if they were two rites. Rather, it's a matter of a twofold use of the same rite. Now, I'll connect the dots for you here in just a second, but let me couple that with the letter that Pope Francis sent out accompanying Traditionis Custodes. Again, he sent out Traditionis Custodes and then a separate letter to the bishops explaining why he came out with Traditionis Custodes. In that accompanying letter, here's what he says. Whoever wishes to celebrate with devotion according to earlier forms of the liturgy can find in the Reformed Missal, that is the Novus Ordo, according to Vatican II, all the elements of the Roman Rite, in particular the Roman canon, which constitutes one of its more distinctive elements. So he's saying everything that makes up the Roman Rite is in the Novus Ordo. Okay. But that's hardly revolutionary because Benedict said the exact same thing in Summorum Pontificum. He already says it's not like these are two different liturgical rites. They're both the same Roman rite, just two different forms of them. So it's inappropriate to speak of these as two different rites. Why am I belaboring this point? Because I just saw, once again, people on social media calling for, well, why doesn't the Pope just make this its own rite? Why doesn't he just call this the Gregorian rite or something like that? Why doesn't he say that the Latin Mass is one rite, kind of like you have the Eastern Catholic rites and stuff like that, the Byzantine rite, Armenian rite? Why don't you just make it its own rite and then you have the Novus Ordo? Well, because that shows a faulty understanding of the Roman rite. That's why. According to Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, and not just them, also John Paul II. But according to the popes, they're the one Roman rite. You can't split them out into multiple rites like that because they're one rite. They're both the Roman liturgy. So I think that some people still need some catechesis on the question of what a rite is and what the Roman rite is and why the popes haven't just basically split off the Latin Mass into its own rite and kind of made it its own thing. This is why, because the popes say it is the Roman rite. So whenever somebody tells you, well, whenever they're limiting the Latin Mass, whether that's a good thing, bad thing, highly debatable, right? But whenever it happens, people people no longer have access to their rite. Well, that's not true. According to the popes, they have access to their rite in the Novus Ordo. What it is they no longer have access to a particular form of that rite. I think it's important for us to understand this distinction because you don't want to make this into something it's not. Whatever criticisms there may be for restricting the Latin Mass, whatever criticisms and maybe poor judgments are being made whenever this happens, what's not happening is that people's right is being taken away. That's not what's happening, according to Pope Benedict, according to Pope Francis. Okay, so now that we've reviewed that, let's now go ahead and transition over to what Bishop Martin from the Diocese of Charlotte is now saying to his priests about the Novus Ordo. I'm going to share my screen. This comes from Rorati Celli, who appears to have broken the news. It appears that this was not initially public, but now that Rorati Celli has made it public, it's up for grabs and open to discussion, right? But they say Rorati was able to obtain the letter written by Bishop of Charlotte, North Carolina, Michael Martin, who last week decreed the almost extinction of the traditional Latin Mass in his diocese. This letter is supposed to be made public sometime in the future, and it was being kept secret since it was written while Francis was still Pope. Francis is referred in the document. It also leads to believe that the decision was to extinguish the traditional Latin Mass in the diocese. This is their editorializing. We're making it known to you now. Okay, so they're saying this was supposed to be made public in the future, but they've obtained a copy of it and they went ahead and released it, ahead of time. Whether that was the right or wrong thing to do is going to be between them and Bishop Martin. Since it's already in the public sphere, since it's already part of public discourse, I'm going to comment on it. Okay. So they say the letter, which is dedicated to a completely anti-liturgical, anti-traditional overhaul, also of the Mass of Paul VI and Novus Ordo Missae, is transcribed in its entirety below. The micromanagement of all aspects of the new Mass in order to make it as anti-traditional as possible is quite astonishing. Some aspects of this have already been implemented at places where the bishop says Mass. For instance, he forbids communion from being distributed at the rail when he celebrates Mass in the churches that normally do that. Okay, so it is a pretty lengthy letter, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. You're welcome to go and read that, on your own time at your own leisure. I'm just going to focus on maybe just some of the highlights. I mean, he talks about he has an introduction here. Then he goes into liturgical rubrics and texts. He goes into Latin language, cross-pollination of the liturgical rites. I don't know if that was the best way to phrase it, since these, the ordinary form, extraordinary form are not rites, as I just proved from Francis and Benedict. The altar and its orientation. We're going to look at what he actually implements here, but he has lengthy sections talking about these things, conclusions and prescriptions. This is kind of where we're going to hone in. And even then, it's still pretty lengthy. So there's a lot of ground to cover here. So for liturgical norms, in terms of the altar rail and its appointments, the following characterize the public sanctuaries and our sacred spaces. In new constructions and renovations of sacred spaces, altar rails are not permitted, he says. And therefore, the sanctuary is to be separated from the nave by a change in elevation. And he cites the General Instruction of the Roman Missal, 295. Movable altar rails should be removed, and permanently fixed altar rails should no longer be used. The placement of a prie-dieu for the reception of communion is not appropriate. The altar is to be freestanding, and Mass must be celebrated facing the people, Germ 299. I mean, these are going to be debatable implementations of the Germ, because while the Germ does mention here versus populum, the rubrics of the Novus Ordo assume ad orientem. So it appears that in the Roman Rite, you're free to do either way, but he's restricting it, saying no, it needs to be facing the people. During the celebration of the liturgy of the Eucharist, the altar is only to contain the corporal purificator vessels containing the Eucharistic elements and Roman Missal. There's no mention of a missal stand. If a priest with visual impairment needs to elevate the book, there can be a simple low-profile book stand that should not obstruct the faithful's view of the Eucharistic species. In terms of candlesticks, they're always to be arranged around the altar. When a cross can't be placed near the altar, it's to be laid flat on the mensa so that the faithful's view is not obstructed. Flowers and other decorations are never to be placed on the mensa of the altar. Regarding the use of technology in the liturgy, care should be taken to make certain that its use enhances the celebration without distractions. He talks about sound equipment, the use of projectors as a place that can be, if utilized properly, a valid worship aid. So that's something we see a lot in like Protestant circles and Protestant worship services. It looks like he's in favor of the projectors coming into the liturgy. So skipping down just a little bit. Projection should not be regularly used in churches for advertising, announcements, simulcast video of the current liturgical moment or liturgical art. The goal of this technology is that it is to be invisible as possible when not functioning in one of the four purposes noted above. Okay, so in terms of the rubrics and text of the Roman Missal, no one or no person may change, add, or remove any part of the rubrics, prayers, or text of the liturgy. This means that elements of the preconciliar Mass, which were eliminated by the Apostolic See, may not be introduced. This is something that a lot of priests and even bishops, I've noticed, have been doing. We saw Bishop Schneider saying that he takes out some parts of the Novus Ordo Mass and inserts some parts of the Latin Mass whenever he celebrates a Novus Ordo. So on his own initiative, he's adding and removing and changing the liturgy. Very controversial on whether or not he can actually do that canonically. But here the bishop is saying, no, you can't do that. You can't like take this part of the ordinary form and couple it with this part from the extraordinary form and like start mixing them up. And, you can't do that on your own initiative. And the idea is that the Mass is the property of the church, not of any one individual. Okay. So in Masses with the faithful, the vernacular is to be retained for all parts of the Mass. Again, he had that lengthy section on the question of Latin, and basically he's saying, look, most people don't know Latin, so unless the majority of people in the audience or in the congregation know Latin, you should be using Latin even in the Novus Ordo. He says, in Masses with the faithful, the vernacular is to be retained for all parts of the Mass. Latin Mass parts are to be chosen judiciously only for those particular celebrations in which the majority of the participants understand the language. So only if the majority of them understand it. Otherwise, it needs to be all vernacular. And, some people are going to point out, I mean, this is just so far removed from what Vatican II was calling for, where it spoke of Latin needing to be retained in the um, Reformed liturgy. But Vatican II, in the same place, also says it's up to Episcopal conferences to determine how much of the vernacular they will introduce. And pretty much all of the Episcopal conferences after Vatican II chose to go with all vernacular. That's why you have pretty much all vernacular in the Roman right now. Okay, so it says, since it's a praiseworthy practice for the bread and wine to be presented by the faithful, the procession of the gifts is to be retained in all public Sunday and holy day masses. Since it's rarely not appropriate for the sign of peace to be exchanged in masses with the faithful, I direct that the faithful always be invited by the deacon, or in its absence, the priest, to exchange the sign of peace. The ringing of a bell to signal the congregation to stand before the opening is no longer to be used. A verbal welcome by the lector, followed by an indication of the hymn to be sung, and an invitation is most appropriate. As far as liturgical vesture, ministers are to wear the prescribed liturgical vestures found in the germ, and the ceremonial bishops in these instructions, there's no option given for priests to wear berettas, cross their stoles, or wear a maniple. Similarly, chasubles cut in the manner commonly referred to as fiddleback are strongly discouraged. These vestments are seen and understood by the faithful as a clear sign of a priest celebrant who prefers the liturgical life of the church prior to Vatican II, given that these vestments have not been seen in most churches around the world since the 60s. Priestly vestiture is not intended to be the place for making such statements, intended or otherwise. So he's saying, because chasubles and maniples are associated with the Latin Mass, and that's the direction the church hasn't gone with since the 60s and since the reform of the liturgy, you shouldn't wear this because it's basically you trying to make a statement that you prefer the old ways rather than the new ways, kind of a thing. Okay, vestments are to be constructed of noble materials and not made overly ornate with overlaid decorations and embroidery. Here he's actually starting to sound like some of the early church popes. One of the popes was like, y'all can't have anything that's highly decorative. Whenever you have your liturgical garments, they need to just be like white, just pure white. Yes, there were some popes who said that they didn't want any kind of elaborate vestments. It just needed to be a pure white vestment. It's starting to remind me of that. Albs that have decoration or lace should have more fabric than decoration. All of a sudden, I'm remembering what Pope Francis said about lace on liturgical garments. There's no option given in the current liturgical books that prescribe certain vesting or divesting prayers. Prayers are prayerful preparation before Mass and Thanksgiving after Masses that take place in some other way, and if possible, in common with the other assisting ministers. Women who have chosen to wear a veil as an expression of personal piety are not to do so when they are assisting in any official capacity, like a lector, cantor, altar server, usher at Mass. So yeah, I guess you can wear it in the congregation, but if you go up to read, the prayers or something, or you go up to read the readings for that day, I guess you got to take the veil off. I don't know what's going on with that. In the area of music is to be chosen in which all the faithful can participate, and pastors must diligently plan their selections. In our present situation, Latin responses and mass parts are not to be utilized in parish churches during regular celebrations, since they hinder people's participation. Retaining the use of masses celebrated in Latin is not opportune in our present reality, since the faithful are not accustomed to it. Even in places where they have become used to it, by more recent practice, this becomes problematic for visitors or new parishioners or those coming to the faith for the first time. So he's saying you don't want to use Latin in the Novus Ordo. Even if the majority of the people know Latin, you still don't want to use it because you might have newcomers or visitors and they won't know Latin, and it will hinder their participation. So that the faithful may participate more actively in the procession and preparation of the altar and the gifts and the distribution of Holy Communion. Hymns are to be chosen that are known by the congregation, easily singable, available through a printed resource such as Pew Hymnal or Worship Aid. Congregational singing is to be fostered by every means possible, even by use of new types of music suited to the culture of the people and to the contemporary spirit. Oh boy, contemporary spirit. There's different ways in which that one can be interpreted, right? Oh boy. I can only imagine what this will look like, in a place that's deeply saturated in charismaticism and Pentecostalism and stuff like that. The celebration of Mass on Sundays and solemnities, regardless of time and day, should be carried out with regard for its inherent and proper festivity. The celebration of so-called quiet masses that are celebrated without music or musical accompaniment is strongly discouraged. The public designation of a mass as high or low is not seen as appropriate. The former patterns that are associated with these designations have shifted, leaving those seeing this in a parish bulletin or signage with a false association with the preconciliar Mass. Concerning those who assist at Mass, in order to show the equal dignity and role of the baptized faithful, both men and women may serve as extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, readers, and altar servers. No one may be denied a liturgical role proper to the faithful based on their gender. This is a circular letter from the Episcopal conferences. So he's saying, male, female, doesn't matter. Everybody's eligible to be extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, a reader, altar server. Nobody can be denied based on their gender. And by the way, thank you, Truth Brigade, for that super sticker here. She says, I appreciate Latin in the Mass because it proves that Christ conquered Rome. However, my first Mass was celebrated in English and it swayed my heathen and heretical heart all the same. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Okay. Extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion are to be trained and employed in those parishes where it will facilitate a more orderly reception of Holy Communion. The number of communion stations at Mass in any church or location should be determined by the number of persons present. A good rule of thumb is 1 communion station per 125 persons in attendance. The reduction of communion stations to eliminate the need for extraordinary forms of holy or extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion is considered an affront to the Church's provision in such circumstances. So the way I read that is he's saying it's not good to reduce them. The reduction of communion stations to eliminate the need for EMHCs is considered an affront to the Church's provision in such a circumstance. So he doesn't want them to be reduced. At least that's the way I'm reading them. Maybe I'm misreading them. I don't know. He says it's preferable and more fitting that Holy Communion be distributed under both species, even when it's necessary to employ the assistance of extraordinary ministers. Any mandates given during the pandemic are hereby lifted, entrusting the decision to receive under both species to the faithful. Altar servers are not to kneel in front of the altar during the Eucharistic prayer with candles. That's interesting. So the altar servers should not kneel in front of the altar, let alone with candles. Wow. Okay. They are to remain at their seat and kneel there. In moments of great solemnity, a thurifer and one other assisting altar server may kneel before the altar to incense during the consecration and should return to their place during the memorial acclamation. I'm surprised he didn't eliminate incense from the direction of these reforms, right? Altar servers are not to wear gloves. In the distribution of Holy Communion, pastors are to catechize the faithful regularly on the normative posture for the reception of Holy Communion in the United States, which is standing after having made a bow of the head, Germ 160. So the norm here, he's saying from the Germ, is to stand and receive Holy Communion after you've bowed. Ministers and catechists are never allowed to teach that it is better to receive Holy Communion in one legitimate way or another, or from an ordained minister than an extraordinary minister. So you can't say it's better to receive from a priest than an extraordinary minister, and you can't say it's better to receive communion on the tongue than on the hand. He's saying you forbidden. Ministers, catechists cannot do anything like that. Since there's no mention in the conciliar documents, the reform of the liturgy, or the current liturgical documents concerning the use of altar rails or kneelers for the distribution of Holy Communion, they are not to be employed in the Diocese of Charlotte. So no more altar rails, no more kneelers. Communion may be denied to those who, after bowing their heads and individually approaching the minister, kneel to receive the sacred host. So, in other words, you can kneel and receive communion kneeling. When distributing Holy Communion, ministers are to hold the host elevated above the vessel and say the body of Christ. The communicant responds, Amen. The minister then places the host of the communicant's tongue or on the communicant's tongue or on the palm of the communicant's hand. So you can receive either in the hand or on the tongue, kneeling or standing. It's forbidden to make the sign of the cross with the host before the communicant, since there's no option to do so in the rubrics. So, there's kind of two different approaches with what I've noticed with some, right? Some take the approach, if it's not in the liturgical books, it's permissible. Others take the view that if it's not in the liturgical books, it's forbidden. It looks like he takes that latter view. The faithful who desire to receive communion on the tongue should be instructed and reminded to open their mouths widely and extend their tongues so as to afford the minister the greatest ease of placing the host on the tongue. The use of communion patens by altar servers is to be implemented judiciously, given the diverse ways in which the faithful can receive. Where communion patens are used, servers should be instructed well to first place the paten low, below where the communicant's hands are, and then move the paten upward should the minister move the to place the host on the tongue. So just kind of moving along with a priest. Then he kind of gives some liturgical preferences, so not necessarily commands, not necessarily prohibitions. He just kind of goes to what he prefers. The understanding and appreciation of the Eucharistic liturgy as a meal suggests that where possible, symbolism of ritual meal should be most clear and manifest. In other words, he's wanting to say, the Eucharist is not just a sacrifice; it's a sacred meal, and so you want to emphasize the meal aspect. As such, it's preferable that the paten be more of a dish style that holds many hosts. There is no need for the larger host elevated at consecration to be afforded its own paten, but rather to be one with the rest of the hosts being brought forward at the offertory and consecrated. Every effort should be made to consecrate the number of hosts needed for the faithful to receive at Mass, leaving the Ciboria and the tabernacle for a small number of remaining consecrated hosts. The use of vestiger for chalice and paten or for the Ciboria similarly lessens the power of symbolic meal and has more connection to a veiled theology, more common in the liturgy prior to the Novus Ordo. The use of a pall to cover the precious blood, even before the consecration, has become common, again, as it was prescribed in the Missal of 62. The use of a pall is helpful if flying insects are present and drawn to the sugar present in the wine. It's preferable that the pall only be placed over the chalice if such insects are present, leaving the chalice uncovered otherwise. That said, the pall should normally be simply laid upon the altar, not in use. When not in use, when use of the pall is necessitated for the presence of insects, it's to be removed during the consecration and elevation. Purification of sacred vessels. The purification of sacred vessels after communion has an appropriate place for practical and theological reasons. However, making this act so elaborate can suggest that a certain scrupulosity has set in. There's no need to use water and wine, as was done prior to the Novus Ordo. Similarly, searching for the faintest dust particles on a paten misses an authentic understanding of the accidents and substance of the Eucharist. I don't know what he means by that. If you're searching for the faintest dust particles on a paten misses an authentic understanding of the accidents and substance. I mean, I obviously know what accidents and substance of the Eucharist is, right? I know what a dust particle is. I'm trying to understand how this is related. Similarly, searching for the faintest dust particles on a paten misses an authentic understanding of the accidents and substance. How? I don't understand how one necessarily means the other. I guess maybe some further elaboration would be needed there. The purification of sacred vessels can also take place at a side table rather than at the altar. Post communion posture immediately upon receiving the Eucharist, either the sacred host or the precious blood. There's no need to bow or genuflect to the altar or tabernacle, nor to make the sign of the cross. Similarly, after returning to your seat, the posture of kneeling or sitting for reflection, prayer, and song are both equally advantageous. It's normative in our church that when the Blessed Sacrament is exposed or the tabernacle open, that we remain kneeling if possible. However, the moments immediately following the reception of the Eucharist by the faithful are unique. In that moment, we all become the body of Christ in the greatest manner possible on this earth. It is the very reason for which Jesus offered us his body and blood, to place greater attention on the Eucharist in Saboria being distributed and later returned to the tabernacle than on the Eucharist we've all become, is to misunderstand the power of the body of Christ and the purpose for which Jesus has shared his body and blood with us. There's no rubric that requires we all remain kneeling until the remaining sacred hosts are returned to the tabernacle. By doing so in that specific moment, we miss the opportunity to focus upon the communion that we all share in Christ and the call that we all have been given to go forth to be the body of Christ in the world. Okay. Location of the presider's chair. In some churches in our diocese, it's become customary as of late to have the presider's chair located on one side or the other of the altar, facing the altar directly. As such, it makes it difficult for the presider to address the people of God during the Mass. In most of these instances, the chair can easily be placed in such a way as to direct appropriate attention to the altar while still affording the presider the opportunity to face the people. So he wants the presider's chair to face people, not the altar. This can be carried out with a placement of the chair behind the altar, facing the people and the altar, or off to the side and angled between the altar and the people. Okay, cantor leading music from the ambo and podium. The people of God benefit from seeing a member of the music community or music ministry encouraging and leading the congregation in song. This should be normally take place from the ambo during the responsorial psalm and from a podium in the sanctuary off to the other side for cueing the faithful. This role is one of real skill, like lecturing, and it requires training. It's not sufficient that the cantor be a gifted singer, but also be adept at facial expression and hand gestures that encourage participation while not becoming a show or distraction. I would like to know what that looks like. what are these facial expressions and hand gestures that both encourage singing, but are not too flashy and too much of a distraction? I would like to see that illustrated. It is most appropriate that the cantor sings the melody from the podium and ambo, and that the cantor be mic'd. I like that. M-I-C apostrophe D, mic'd. The fact that the rest of the music ministry is situated to the choir loft in most churches should not keep the cantor from leading the congregation from these locations in the sanctuary. Okay, the use of worship aids. Lastly, there are many ways in which a worship aid can be a blessing during the celebration of the Mass. The most common use is for song, and there are multiple fine options on the market for parishes to consider. There's also several subscription services that individuals can utilize that are print and electronic, can be of assistance. That said, the use of these aids during celebration of the Mass should be limited. In particular, their use during the proclamation of the word should be considered exceptional, non-normative. Why? Well, what we believe about the word being proclaimed at Mass is often overlooked and underappreciated. If I were to sit down to speak to my beloved in an intimate moment of self-expression, would it be appropriate for my beloved to be reading the text if they had it in advance as I was speaking to her or him? I'm trying to figure out why a bishop would speak of his beloved in her him. That didn't land very well. I don't think he intended that, but somebody should have edited that and said, I don't know if this is the best analogy. All right, let's move forward. Of course not. Rather, they would sit attentively with eyes upon me, leaning on every word hopefully. That should be our approach at Mass. Certainly, this assumes great proclaimers of the word during the liturgy of the word, calling us to train them. Well, the answer is not worship aids, but rather our preparation prior to the Mass and even reading the readings in advance. The same is true, but to a lesser extent with the rest of the prayers said at Mass. Listening without reading along in a missal has greater potential to more fully engage us in the liturgy, where sight and sound and smell lift us to a greater place. All of the above recognizes that there are those with special needs that may necessitate a more frequent use of these aids. That said, other steps should be taken first to improve the quality of proclamation, sound, and the availability of audio enhancing devices for those in need in all places of worship. Okay. Like I said, it's a longer document. I mean, you could see there's a lot more. I just read to you just the conclusion part. There was a whole lot more where he's going into the stuff in more detail. You're welcome to go and read it. Again, it's posted at Rorati. Evidently, it wasn't supposed to be published this early, but somehow Rorati got it and went ahead and published it. From what it seems they're saying, it seems this was supposed to be made known in the future, but not just yet. But since it's already part of the public discourse, right or wrong, no matter how it got here, it's already part of the public discourse. So I just went ahead and did some commentary on it. I also want to briefly shift gears here. Well, before I do that, let me just ask, do y'all think that this is a good thing? Do you think that this is maybe could have been done better? Y'all appreciate this, especially on the heels of restricting the Latin masses. Like it's one thing to restrict the Latin mass and then really enhance a Novus Ordo. It's another to restrict the Latin mass and maybe even downgrade the Novus Ordos, right? Because the people who are no longer having access to the Latin mass, what they're going to have access to is the Novus Ordo. And so if you're downgrading the Novus Ordo, that's what you're leaving people with. Or do you think this is not downgrading? Do you think that this was actually elevating and enhancing? Or do you think it's downgrading? Black says, but Michael, Domino Ciesus. There you go. I mean, it settles it, right? I love it. Y'all were paying attention during that show. Good job. I appreciate that. I've had several people pull that up, or bring up that reference from that show we did most recently on Outside the Church There Is No Salvation, a comprehensive examination, I think is the name of the title. We had fun with that one. But Michael, Domino Ciesus says, right. So, let's briefly shift gears here and take a look at what Cardinal Casper is now saying about the women diaconate. Oh, but first, I do have something to show y'all. I came across this on Twitter, where you find anything and everything. Somebody painted an icon of Pope Francis with the words todos, 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 all at the top. Here you can see very clearly Pope Francis with his well-known, famous cross that he would wear. Let's see here. So I want to get y'all's thoughts on this. Do y'all like this? And are y'all ready for a canonization of Pope Francis? Because I think it's coming. I really do believe it's coming under Pope Leo XIV. He's already said like 3 different times now, Pope Francis is in heaven praying for the church. I think he's going to be canonized. Do you think that's a good thing? You think that's a bad thing? I want to hear your thoughts. Truth Brigade says, this is one diocese, one in Rome. Thank you for the super sticker. All right, let's go ahead and shift gears here to Cardinal Casper, who's back in the news. Y'all remember Casper, right? He was actually part of a lot of discussions between Catholics and Orthodox on the question of the papacy way before he entered into controversial circles with the Synod on marriage and that whole situation there with the Mors Laetitia, leading up to a Mors Laetitia and communion for divorced and remarried. He played a huge role in that controversy at the time. So you probably recall him from that. But he just gave an interview, or actually I think this is from his book, where he is now saying women's diaconate would make sense. So he's calling for female diaconate. German Cardinal Walter Casper, who lives in Rome, is open to reform. In his autobiography published June 10th, he advocates opening the diaconate to women. So this was published in an article 3 days ago. German Cardinal Walter Casper advocates for women's diaconate in the Catholic Church and believes further reforms are necessary. In my personal opinion, he says, opening the permanent diaconate to women has sound theological arguments in its favor and would be a sensible pastoral step, the 92-year-old writes in his autobiography. Wow, he's 92? Wowzers. Women and men have equal dignity before God and must therefore be recognized with their own charisms, Casper says. In this regard, he says, some progress has been made in recent decades, but much remains to be done. The book On the Trail of Truth will be published June 10th. Initiatives by reform-minded Catholics, several Catholic women's associations, and numerous submissions to the recent worldwide synodal process are in favor of introducing women's diaconate. Some advocate for opening all services and offices in the Catholic Church to women. Until now, the offices of deacon, priests, and bishops, confirmed by ordination, have been reserved for men. Deacons may baptize, marry, conduct funerals, and preach, but not preside over Mass. Only priests may do that. Thank you for the super sticker. Matthew says, Casper is a wolf in sheep's clothing. I appreciate the super sticker there. So it seems like the article is under the impression that you could have women's ordination to the priesthood and bishop. I just still wonder how any Catholic could suggest that in light of Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. The need for catechesis among Catholics is desperate at this point, to say the least. The position of women in the Catholic Church has now become a mega issue, emphasizes the Rome-based cardinal and former bishop of Rottenburg, Stuttgart. There are many offices in the church with leadership responsibility that don't require sacramental authorization and to which women can also be entrusted, he said. The time of clericalism is over, he says. And that kind of harkens to what Pope Francis was often saying. The cardinals also emphasized the need for a new, more fraternal culture in the relationship between ministers and Catholic laity. We'll continue to need good bishops and priests in the future, but in a synodal church, the time of clericalism and arbitrary decisions by bishops is over, Casper wrote. The laity want and should be heard, and they can also expect accountability from bishops and priests. So he thinks that this is what the laity want. I mean, I don't know, maybe the laity in Germany are calling for this. I don't know what the situation is like. We occasionally have some commenters from Germany in the comment section, but I don't think that they would be in favor of it. But maybe that's not indicative of what the laity in Germany are really calling for, like as a whole. I don't know. For those of y'all who are in Germany or in that nearby area, are y'all calling for women's ordination? Casper also anticipates a shrinking church. I wonder why. Why would he anticipate that? In a less religious environment, perhaps soon we will be a diaspora church and return to the situation of the early church. This does not frighten him. Casper emphasizes the early church was not a holy remnant of which some dream today. It was a holy beginning from which our church, like a small mustard seed, grew into a large tree, providing shade for the farthest corners of the earth. True, but they were made up of a community of people who underwent extreme forms of penance, unlike today. You might have to do like 20 years of penance before you could receive the Eucharist if you committed adultery. These days, you just go to confession and you can receive the Eucharist that day. So yeah, I don't know if you can really make a fair comparison with today's church and the early church. New promising developments often originate from small but determined groups. As many attentive observers predict, it could also happen that the young, often small but vibrant churches of the southern hemisphere bring new momentum to the church and soon make us Europeans look old, he writes. Without conversion, prayer, and repentance, all reforms, no matter how well-intentioned, have no future. But the one he's calling for here, women's diaconate. I don't know. What do y'all think? Y'all want to see, women deaconesses being brought back to the Latin Rite? You already have Eastern Orthodox bringing it back in the Alexandrian Church. We've seen that before. I actually requested to interview one of the women deaconesses that the Eastern Orthodox have recently ordained. We see it among some of the Oriental Orthodox. They've retained women deaconesses all along. They never got rid of them. The Latin Rite got rid of deaconesses probably in like 1200s, 1300s, maybe somewhere around there. And so you haven't really seen any in the Latin Rite since then. Do you think they should be brought back? You think this would be a good opportunity in light of today's situation that's really pushing for women's role in ministry, or do you think that that would be a bad idea? I do want to hear from you on that. Benantium says, let's bring veils back. Michael with the hard coffee sip. It was one of those Kermit the Frog coffee sips. Well, he was drinking tea in reality, but y'all remember that, right? The Kermit the Frog. Let me show y'all that meme. Sips his tea. It's one of my favorites. That and the Star Wars one. I'll show you. Over here where he's just sipping that tea, minding his own business. I like this one too. Evil Kermit the Frog memes. Those are some of my favorites. I'm a meme connoisseur. I appreciate a good meme. Although Father Brown showed me yesterday that I don't know all the memes. He showed me an astronaut one that evidently I knew nothing about. Okay, so D Bear says no female deacons. Okay, I appreciate you sharing that. Hey, Big Stack, good to see you. He says support R&T, hit the like button, and hit that subscribe button too. Do both if you don't mind, if you appreciate this show. Matthew says Leo is against it. Doesn't matter for Casper. Is Leo against female diaconate? I've never seen that. I know he's against women to the priesthood. I've never seen him be against women to the diaconate. Did you find something? If so, let me know in the comment section. Follow up with me, Matthew, in just a moment. I need to see, because did he say something when he was bishop or cardinal about excluding women from the diaconate? If he did, I missed that, and I need to see that, because I've only seen him comment on the question of women to the priesthood. I've never seen the diaconate question. And that's going to be important because the DDF is supposed to come out with a document on women deaconesses. And there is supposed to be a decision made by Rome on the question of women deaconesses. That has been put back on the table. And so Rome's going to have to weigh in on it. And it'll be interesting to see. Michael, we want your opinion too. Well, would it be good to bring back women deaconesses in today's climate? Well, I understand some who say, yeah, give women as much as possible to show that the church is not oppressive to women and stuff like that. I don't know if that should be the motivation. And it feels like it just might mislead a lot of people, and it would just suggest that now the church is kind of open to opening up the next steps up to women's ministry, which clearly the church can't do according to Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. You can't have women priests or bishops because of that. It was taught infallibly, definitively. It did not address the women deaconesses issue, but it did exclude priesthood. But by bringing that about in this environment where so many people are pushing for women's ordination to the priesthood, aren't you just kind of giving people the impression that we're inching closer to it, kind of a thing? It doesn't seem like a very good idea on the whole. That's my opinion. Somebody might argue, oh, no, I think it's a good idea for this and that. Tim says, good to see you, by the way, Tim. He says, Kermit is about to be U of Maryland's commencement speaker. Lofton T. Yeah. Skylar says, no female deacons. Here's another part. Here's another issue. There's two issues going on. Not only women deaconesses. You already know that you could technically have that in the Latin Rite, right? Because you've already had that before. But then there's still an additional debate on whether that was sacramental or non-sacramental. And there's a pretty big raging debate on that. And there are some really difficult texts to account for if you take the position that it was non-sacramental. And I think we've explored that before in previous shows. Okay. Michael, can you explain the context of what the deaconesses were in the church before versus what they'd be pushing for now? Well, different roles at different times. In some locations and in some times, the women deaconesses only served as assistance in baptisms where baptisms were done nude. And so the bishop wouldn't touch a nude woman, and so the woman would assist. And so that was back in the milk and honey days where you would apply milk and honey to the baptized person as well, right? Some wild stuff in the early church. So there's reasons for that, theological reasons, by the way. It wasn't out of nowhere. Um, in other parts, they had a liturgical role at the altar with the chalice and with actually, you know, saying certain parts of the liturgy, the litany, stuff like that. Much like you have male deacons doing today, for example, in the Byzantine liturgy, women would have done that role as well. So, for anybody who tells you they didn't have a liturgical role at the altar, that's just simply not true. We have evidence from deaconesses in Rome where they clearly did, um, among other places. So, yeah. In some cases, they preached homilies. In other cases, that was considered an abuse. So there was kind of different views there. Um, I suspect that if they were brought back, they would be brought back to have a liturgical function, and not just limited to baptisms. If anything, Michael has videos on female deaconesses, including one on what the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon says on it, which allows for it. Yes, that's correct. The Fourth Ecumenical Council did of course allow for female deaconesses. Sandra says, please, no deaconesses, just say no. You open that door, what other door will open? Well, I mean, it goes to both ways, right? I mean, like I said, Chalcedon, the Fourth Ecumenical Council allows for it. Did they allow for women priests? Not necessarily, right? So somebody might just come back and say, no, it doesn't mean that you have to open the door to that. And okay, I understand it doesn't necessarily mean that, but might you be misleading people? Might you kind of be giving them a certain impression? Something worth considering. Dominique says, I suppose the church would need a myriad of qualifiers to be super clear about the doctrinal boundaries surrounding deaconesses. Yeah, which might be what the DDF's upcoming document will do. D-Bear says, Michael, my pastor decided to limit altar servers to just boys, and he created a sacristan program for girls. There is something that I would like to see spread. I never had that option as a girl. Thank you for sharing that. Definitely seems different than what the Bishop of Charlotte is going for. Matthew says he said no to clericalized women. Right. I recall that, but I recall that in the context of the women priesthood thing. I don't know if he was saying that about the diaconate, and might he mean that in such a way that would still allow for women deaconesses without clericalizing them. The thing is, I've seen people say that, and then they could still be in favor of women deaconesses because they square it away in their mind and make sense of it in some kind of way. So just saying that no to clericalizing women does not mean he's opposed to women as deaconesses. That it doesn't necessarily mean that. So if that's what you were referring to, I don't think that closes the door on the matter from Pope Leo. Not sure if I saw that comment from 2023. I did, but I don't think it necessarily excludes women deaconesses. For better or worse, I don't think that means that he's opposed to it necessarily. Maybe he is. Maybe he is. I don't think that means that he is, though. Okay. What cardinal out of Germany is advocating for? How is it not heresy? If 1994, under John Paul II, Ordinatio Sacerdotales, he affirmed the church has no authority to confer priestly ordination on women. Right. No priestly ordination of women. Cardinal Casper was talking about women diaconate. I didn't see him suggest women priesthood. I saw the person writing the article suggesting it, but I didn't see Casper suggesting women priesthood. I didn't see that, although I have seen other very high up, well-placed cardinals in the Catholic Church pushing for women's ordination. And I have to ask to them how they make sense of Ordinatio Sacerdotales in light of them. Okay. Jimmy says 214 people watching. Hit the like and subscribe to join RNT. Yeah, please do that. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. I really would appreciate it. One commenter says no to female deacons. I think it would be very imprudent. The church in the post-conciliar time has not been precise enough in languages, fiducia supplicans, for example. Yeah, I mean, whatever misunderstandings people had of fiducia supplicans, I've always said it could have been more clear on some points. I think it's sufficiently clear for people who are of goodwill and are well trained in theology and are reading it carefully, but most people aren't those things. A lot of people aren't of goodwill. A lot of people aren't trained in theology. A lot of people don't read things carefully. So it could have been written better. And so I hear what you're saying. Yeah. Edgar says yes to female deacons. Women are more pastoral. That's an interesting perspective. Sid says, any advice for young men discerning priesthood looking for traditional liturgical community? That would be a good question for maybe Father Brown to answer next time he's in the chat. I would definitely recommend talking to him. Hit the like button if you noticed Michael's new blazer. You noticed, Jimmy. You noticed. That's right. It is a new blazer. So I got about 4 or 5 of them now. So give y'all some variety. That's great. I'm glad somebody noticed. Okay, well, I think I grabbed everything. We're at the hour mark. We'll go ahead and end it here. May have another show for y'all later on today. We'll see how things go. There's a lot of stuff to talk, a lot of topics to cover, a lot of stuff to go over. So I might do a second show later on. We'll see. So, but if you want to know, I'm going to do another show, and if you want to be alerted to it, what you need to do is hit the subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications so you know when I go live, because sometimes I just go live out of nowhere. I just kind of feel like, you know what? I want to talk about this, and I go live. But you'll only know that if you hit the sub button, hit the like button. New blazer summer. Yeah. Jimmy says, to be fair, my wife did. She noticed the new blazer. She told you yesterday. Would those women deacons wear a veil? Maybe, but not necessarily. How might you posit moving us towards better catechesis? Wow, that's a lot at the end of a show. Certainly, the people who are over your local OCIA themselves need to be better catechized, and if they knew more, that would help tremendously, just because all the new people coming in being catechized would just be well more informed. Some of the people, not all, but some of the people over the OCIA programs, in my opinion, I think they need to continue to work on their catechesis before they're in that position. And unfortunately, I have to say the same thing about priests, bishops, and even cardinals. You fix that part with the clergy, it's going to trickle down. But, I don't have any control over the clergy and fixing all that. I don't have any control over any of that. So, but yeah, that's kind of what needs to be done. All right, that's going to do it. I'll probably see y'all later for another show. But please, if you enjoyed this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Greatly appreciate your support. See you later. God bless.